Hello, and welcome back to the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power. My name is Zaid Wahab, and today we will reflect on all the time we have spent together. We'll look back on what we learned to glean insights on what it says about the Arabs, Islam, history, and of course, power. That sort of stuff. While I've tried to remain objective thus far, it's just going to be one man's opinion this time around. Basically a long, loosely structured ramble about everything we've covered and what stands out to me about it. If that sounds appealing to you, then join me one last time in episode 90, Reflections. You know what? This last episode is something I'm putting together for my own sake. So I'm going to skip the part I always dread drafting the most. The opening bit, where I don't say much, but kind of get listeners primed for what we're about to discuss. I've wasted literal hours trying to come up with stuff that is tangentially relevant to the subject matter without feeling contrived. But not this time. I'm just going to take us straight into whatever it is I want to say today. I guess the first thing I want to say is thank you to everyone who stuck with me through this pet project. It's been a pleasure hearing from many of you, whether with questions or kind offers of friendship. I deeply value the virtual presence of everyone who listened to my episodes. Your support kept me going through uncertain times. I'm not sure I would have seen this through without you. That's why I often refer to this as our podcast. It honestly took all of us to make it happen. So thank you, you're welcome, and congrats. Despite it being over 5 years since we embarked on this journey, I only rarely mention the podcast to people in real life. It's not a dirty little secret or anything. I'm mostly over the awkwardness of hearing recordings of my own voice. But believe it or not, the topic of early Arab history rarely comes up in casual conversation. In the few cases when I have told someone that I'm making a podcast about it, I usually get one of two good questions. Either an emphatic, "Why?" or an inquisitive, "Did you learn anything interesting?" Short answers are "why not?" and "yes," but I'd like to account for both questions more comprehensively today. So let's start with why. I don't mean why read history, but why read Al-Yaqubi, Al-Tabari, and Al-Mas'udi specifically. In my opinion, the best reason to study history is to make better sense of the world around you. So these medieval authors weren't very high up on my reading list. The first book I read on the subject was The Arabs by Eugene Rogan, which discussed what things were like under the Ottoman Empire. By the time I was done with it, things were somehow clearer, and I had 1,000 new questions. In search of answers, I went through many more books, most informative of which was Al-Birhurani's The History of the Arab Peoples. It was exactly what I was looking for, an account of the Arabs through the ages, all the way up to modernity. Given its considerable scope, it didn't discuss any single era in great detail, and, like before, the answers I found in Dr. Hourani's book only fed my curiosity. As I read more on the subject of Arab history, I came across two related problems. The first was that there seemed to be very little consensus on historical fact up until the Arabs had developed societies capable of keeping and transmitting written histories. The second was that the earliest part of the journey, the part surrounding the birth of Islam, was seen through an explicitly religious lens. I regularly came across books that delivered vastly different impressions of the same society at the same point in time. Even more perplexingly, they would cite the same medieval sources, with the inimitable Al-Tabari coming up more often than not. There are multiple reasons why Al-Tabari's history towers over other surviving records. The man himself was a highly educated and respected court official, who served in Baghdad as a jurist, judge, and eventually even as a royal tutor. He lived through some of the Abbasid Caliphate's critical junctures: its slide into anarchy after al-Mutawakkil and its unlikely recovery under al-Mu'tadid. Perhaps most importantly, Al-Tabari was an independently wealthy polymath, and he undertook the task of writing down the many oral accounts that could be found at the time out of a love of erudition and not at the behest of a sponsor. Although he must have had opinions about the various narrations he captured in his history, the author almost never comments on the likely validity of this or that account. Al-Tabari limited his analytical contribution to ordering narrations chronologically and according to the events they discussed. In doing so, he basically created a database of early Islamic historical lore. Virtually every book on the first 3 centuries of Islam either cites Al-Tabari's vital repository of oral testimony or cites a work which cites it. There's simply no doing without it. Obviously, I felt compelled to read Al-Tabari's great work when I first learned about it. I imagined it would contain all the answers that had eluded me, even on controversial questions pertaining to the first generation of Islam. My naive enthusiasm did not take me very far. I tried and failed to make much headway a couple times before giving up. Even with reasonably good command of Arabic, readers will still find it difficult to understand the language as it was employed in the 10th century. It didn't help that Al-Tabari was addressing his contemporaries, and therefore assumes his audience is entirely familiar with all the terms, customs, and names mentioned throughout. On top of that, there is the dissonance of reading conflicting accounts with subsequent events building upon their disparate conclusions. In my opinion, knowledge of early Arab history is a prerequisite for navigating Al-Tabari's indispensable magnum opus. In order to help me make it through the intentional incoherence, I decided to use al-Yaqubi and al-Mas'udi as guides. Their approach was nowhere near as comprehensive, so my plan was to use their accounts of certain reigns or events as summaries to keep in mind before reading Al-Tabari's many narrations on the same subject. Doing so helped me feel more confident that I knew what to look out for. It was like having guardrails to hold onto as I slowly made my way through a winding path strewn with myriad twists and turns. So as I was saying, I had some questions I hoped Al-Tabari could answer for me. The overtly military or political ones were lavished with plenty of insightful commentary. Questions of a more social nature, for example, what a day in the life of a citizen, a woman, a soldier, or a slave was like, went completely unaddressed, and I had to cobble together my own answers using bits of evidence from various narrations on other topics. Finally, questions about the validity of different interpretations of early Islamic society were only exacerbated by the sheer volume of contradictory testimony we come across. Al-Tabari wisely made no attempt at settling those debates, and instead presented the full variety he encountered on this much disputed period. I don't intend on breaking this episode up into themes, so we're just going to go through 300 years of history in one long stretch, with intermittent stops here and there to discuss subjects that I'm interested in. Okay, I've told you enough about what I'm going to tell you. It's time to get started in earnest. In this, we face the same challenge we did at the outset of our podcast. We can't talk about the Caliphate without saying a few words about pre-Islamic society and the Prophet's own journey. I am again going to try and skirt around religious commentary, mainly because I think the most useful framing of Islam for our purposes is a sociological one. Muhammad was born into a deeply unjust tribal society, and his lifelong struggle can validly be portrayed as an attempt to reform it. Although his orphanhood was a real disadvantage, he belonged to a prominent clan of the noble Quraysh tribe, so his position was quite promising compared to your average 6th century Arab. Let me expand on what I mean by a noble tribe, because it'll help explain how pre-Islamic Arab society worked and the role played by the Prophet's tribe. Quraysh was the main tribe of Mecca, a city which had developed around the Kaaba, a holy shrine revered by the nomads of the Arabian Peninsula. Before Islam, the Arabs ascribed religious meaning to a number of natural phenomena: lightning, shooting stars, water springs, and they worshipped idols as a way of communing with the unknowable divine. Idols were arranged inside the Kaaba in a manner that reflected the standing of their respective tribes in society. Since tribes were made up of family units, the better organized a tribe was, the larger and more powerful it grew. Strong tribes not only enjoyed uncontested control of their ancestral grazing lands, but they could also traverse the desert at will. Weak tribes, on the other hand, could only survive by forging alliances. Otherwise, they risked being wiped out by whatever party coveted their lands, flocks, or women. This brutal, dog-eat-dog state of affairs was the norm across the peninsula, except for 3 months of every year around Mecca. Some sources say it was 4 months, but the disagreement here is about intercalation, the annual process by which the Arabs righted their lunar calendar. These were the holy months, when spilling blood in the vicinity of the Kaaba was considered sacrilegious. The Arabs congregated in Mecca during those months to marry, trade, worship, and of course, drop their sickest new poetry of the year. This annual period of cultural and social efflorescence was entirely overseen and managed by the city's hosts, the Quraysh. Their successful execution of this role made Quraysh's elders highly regarded across the region and allowed them to establish matrimonial ties with most of the other tribal leaders. These relationships were vital to both Mecca and Quraysh's prosperity. Because of its connections, the tribe could trade from Yemen to Syria without the need for a security escort. No matter how laden with goods or wealth, Quraysh's caravans went unmolested on their long journeys north and south, an advantage enjoyed by no other tribe. Notice how intimately the religious and social were intertwined in pre-Islamic Arabia. Quraysh's standing was underwritten by its stewardship of a holy shrine, something it used to reinforce the tribal order and maintain its central position within. The advent of Islam upended everything, but it's important to accurately characterize the relationship between Islam and the pre-existing tribal culture, because the tension between them will be the first of 3 major themes animating our discussion of the evolution of Arab society. It is a tension that remained decisively relevant for a surprisingly long time, a century into the dynastic age. Although Islam represented a rebellion against the tribal order, the new religion also resembled the context it had emerged from. An obvious parallel is the importance of the Kaaba, an aspect adopted relatively late in the Prophet's mission. Islam also praised classical tribal virtues like generosity, bravery, and forbearance, although not when they were employed for personal or tribal glory. the major source of friction between the old and new came down to the issue of social justice. The Prophet rejected the might makes right world he was born into. He preached that the most blessed household was one which cared for orphans, that manumission was the greatest act a person could perform. Islam's vision was one of equality before a single God, with no room for distinctions based on tribe, wealth, or social standing. For obvious reasons, such a vision appealed to the downtrodden and threatened those who benefited from the status quo. We can find more evidence to justify this perspective if we examine how Arabs refer to their own history. The following may resonate with Arabic speakers more than others, but I want to take a quick aside here to justify the relevance of our sociological take on the advent of Islam. The pre-Islamic era is referred to as Asr al-Jahiliyyah, or the age of Jahiliyyah. To modern speakers, the word Jahiliyyah seems to be derived from the root word jahl, which today means ignorance. This leads them to believe that the juxtaposition is between religious ignorance and knowledge, that Islam enlightened the Arabs to the truth of the one creator, etc. But that is not what the word jahl meant back then. The Prophet's uncle, for example, was known as Abu Jahl, and it makes no sense to think that he named his son ignorance. No, jahl used to mean might. There is a line of pre-Islamic poetry which attests to this. It goes, أَفَلَا يَجْهَلَنَّ أَحَدٌ عَلَيْنَا فَنَجْهَلُ فَوْقَ جَهْلِ الْجَاهِلِينَ, which can be translated, poorly, as, let nobody act mighty towards us, for we'll outmight the mightiest might. Similarly, Islam derives its name from silm, which means calm or civility, a reference to the prohibition on inflicting harm on one another that Muhammad made all members of his umma pledge to. And so the religion was intended to take the Arabs from the age of might is right to one in which they would behave peaceably towards one another. That said, the advent of Islam can be investigated from different perspectives. The Arabs were essentially the last pagans in their part of the world, a part that had witnessed the organizational benefits of religion for thousands of years. Their prevailing norms, which pitted tribes against each other in a constant quest for survival, could only take them so far. By the time Muhammad was born, these nomadic folk had accumulated a substantial degree of shared culture. The Arabs had been observing months of holy truce annually for centuries, a ritual which reinforced their bond as a people. That's internally. Externally, they were virtually surrounded by Abrahamic religions. The Byzantines and Ethiopians were both Christian, as were the Arab confederations guarding imperial borders in Syria and Iraq. Yemen's last Arab king was Jewish, as were up to 15% of the people living in the western part of the peninsula. Islam's birth can thus be seen as the Arabs taking inspiration from what's around them, now that they had enough in common to unite around. The religion even acknowledges Judaism and Christianity, and presents itself as the last in a line of Abrahamic religions revealed to mankind, one which intentionally addressed the Arabs in their own tongue. Quraysh quickly recognized the budding religion as a hazard, and its elders at first ostracized, then violently persecuted the earliest Meccan converts. Islam internalized its struggle against the dominant tribe, and the overwhelming majority of all the prophets in the Quran are described as champions of the poor and the meek faced by tyrannical elites of the existing order. Besides Adam and King Solomon, every prophet story retold in the Quran is of a truth-teller who refused to be cowed by the powers that be and persevered in his holy mission of divine justice to the very end. Moses, Noah, Job, Lot, Joseph, Jesus, Abraham, and many others are praised for having endured terrible suffering at the hands of their own antagonists without ever deviating from the path God had laid out for them. Muhammad was simply the last in this long line of prophets, sent to enlighten the last group of people who still had not heard the proverbial good word. Quraysh were his bitterest rivals from the outset, and they used their tribal connections to make sure Muslims were shunned by all other tribes as well. They ridiculed the Prophet for consorting with slaves, tribeless folks, and other social pariahs. After enduring their abuse for years, the Ummah caught a break when 2 tribes from nearby Yathrib invited Muhammad and his 60-odd followers to set up shop in their town. This did not end Quraysh's hostility, however. The Ummah's first battle was waged against it, and the Meccans rallied allied tribes in 2 major subsequent battles as well. Muhammad's role shifted considerably after his arrival in Yathrib, which came to be known as Madinat al-Rasul, the Prophet's city, or Medina for short. No longer just a holy messenger, he now had to lead a community comprised of various tribes. See, when a tribe joined the Ummah, it did not dissolve its structure entirely. In fact, conversions often occurred in a tribal manner, as in a tribe's members accepted the new religion altogether only after its elders had. Nomadic religious practices were more shamanic or priestly than personal. A tribe would have a deity that all its members believed in, so to speak, but ceremonies or prayers were entirely carried out by a holy elder. Islam rejected this setup entirely. Even if you see Muhammad as simply monopolizing this role, he was the first to inform believers that they themselves had religious duties incumbent upon them. In becoming Muslims, they swore a pledge to follow the Prophet, agreed to a pact of mutual defense with the Ummah, and the wealthy had to share 20% of their possessions with the rest of the community. The Prophet administered this wealth, and he faithfully distributed it among those who lacked the means to support themselves. This arrangement, especially the Mutual Defense Pact and Social Safety Net, proved extremely attractive to small tribes who were typically desperate to find allies in the harsh world of pre-Islamic Arabia. The impressive character of the Prophet and the inspiring sense of camaraderie displayed by his followers convinced many to convert, and the Ummah soon grew into an imposing tribal coalition, united more firmly than any that had come before it. Following a failed siege of Medina, Quraysh and its allies were forced to enter into a truce with the Ummah, and when an allied tribe violated its terms a year or so later, Mecca was overwhelmed by thousands of Muslim warriors and surrendered without a fight. The bloodless conquest took place about 8 years after Muhammad had left his hometown. Quraysh's conversion to Islam came shortly afterwards and marked the religion's ultimate triumph over the old tribal order. In taking Mecca, Muhammad succeeded in uniting all the peninsula's tribes under the banner of Islam, but he only lived for 2 years after. With the Prophet's passing came a jolting realization. Islam had not supplanted tribal culture after all. Several tribes, especially those who joined late, abandoned the Ummah, their elders saying that they had pledged fealty to Muhammad and Muhammad was gone. Such a tribal understanding of their connection to the faith shows how vital and consequential the struggle between Islam and the tribal remained. The Prophet was no longer there to mediate this relationship. That responsibility now fell to his successors, al-Khulafa, or the Caliphs. The popular controversy about the succession to the Prophet surrounds the denial of his cousin, Ali bin Abi Talib, but we'll have more to say about him and his descendants later. I want us to stay focused on the tension between Islam and the tribal, so let's instead consider Abu Bakr's election by examining it from a different angle. As allied tribes were peeling away and hostile ones mustered their forces on the outskirts of Mecca, elite representatives of the two core groups of the early Ummah gathered to decide the matter of leadership. These were the Meccans who had left Mecca with the Prophet, the Muhajirun, and those who had received them in Medina, the Ansar. The Ansar proposed leadership alternate between these two groups. Since the Prophet was from Mecca, his successor ought to be from Medina. The Meccan response was that only someone from Quraysh stood a chance at uniting the Arabs. A very tribal argument, but I think also a sound one. The Ansar had Islamic credentials, but the Muhajirun were of Quraysh, which gave them both religious and tribal appeal. The Arabs abandoning the Ummah were doing so because they still saw the world through a tribal lens. Choosing a leader from Quraysh would make it that much easier for them to come back into the fold. Abu Bakr's campaign to reunite the tribes was indeed swift, successful, and far less violent than its name, the Apostasy Wars, suggests. Most tribes freely returned to the Ummah, something which probably had a lot to do with its retention of a Qurayshi leader. I'm not suggesting that in Abu Bakr's election, the tribal had won out over the Islamic. Just that the tension between the two was an important factor to consider. In fact, there are no indications that Abu Bakr deviated from the Islamic social customs introduced by the Prophet one bit. Throughout his short tenure, he justified every decision he made by tying it back to the Prophet's teachings or example. Most critically, Abu Bakr lived humbly amongst the people and distributed the Ummah's wealth just as Muhammad had. The first caliph only reigned for 2 years, and he selected Umar ibn al-Khattab as his successor before passing away. Umar's reign represents the apex of the triumph of Islam over the tribal. The new caliph actively pursued policies that stood up for the little guy against tribal leaders, especially those from Quraysh. We have so many examples to pick from. Umar stopped distributing the wealth equally as his predecessors had. He gave more to the Muhajirun and Ansar at the expense of those who joined Islam late in the game, like Quraysh and its allies. When challenged on this deviation from Muhammad's ways, the caliph's reply was that he could not in good conscience equate between those who fought with the Prophet and those who had fought against him. Another story I like is when Umar heard that the victorious general Khalid ibn al-Walid had given a generous award to a poet who'd praised his deeds in verse. He summoned Khalid to Medina and had Bilal al-Habashi rough him up a little while the caliph gave him a dressing down. An Ethiopian slave manumitted by the Prophet, manhandling this pride of Quraysh after he'd conquered both empires, is peak early Islam. That said, the most important of Umar's policies against Quraysh was his prohibition on any of them leaving Mecca. He knew his tribe would instantly seek to capitalize on the expansion of the Ummah's territory in a way that would empower its own elites. There is a lot to praise in Umar's reign. It truly was exemplary in many aspects. He skillfully navigated the social upheaval brought about by the fall of the two empires that had surrounded the Arabs since time immemorial. He forbade the Arabs from settling among other peoples, and decreed that they should only live where they could be reached from Medina on camelback. Whenever the caliph had to introduce changes, he hewed closely to Muhammad's example, often asking Ali bin Abi Talib for his opinions on what the Prophet would have done. Umar owned absolutely nothing and held his own family to a far higher ethical standard than others, earning the Ummah's love as a living embodiment of Islamic virtue. I believe that the Caliph realized that despite his best efforts, the expansion of his realm and its riches made it all the more difficult to keep the tribal elite in check. Only a commanding figure with uncontested authority could hope to constrain their social influence. Umar also recognized that many in the Ummah saw the Prophet's cousin, Ali bin Abi Talib, as his only legitimate successor. There were convincing reasons for this, not least of all the final speech given by the Prophet in which he declared that Ali should be considered his successor in all things. Ali was the first Muslim child, and he grew up in the faith following his cousin's example. These parallels were commendable, but a politically worrying similarity between Muhammad and Ali was their antipathy towards the tribal elite. While the Prophet's uncompromising attitude towards them was suited for a rebellion against an unjust order, Ali's refusal to acknowledge their importance to the Ummah made his election as its leader seem like it would be a destabilizing development. Omar only managed to hold everything together because nobody from Quraysh dared to break ranks and present the Ummah with an alternative. Ali's antagonism towards the elites made it unlikely that he would enjoy the same sort of backing from his tribe. Even though Omar fell abruptly to an assassin's blade, he attempted to engineer a succession that fostered Qurayshi unity. He tasked 6 of the Muhajirun, the core group of Meccan Muslims who had immigrated to Medina with the Prophet, with selecting a caliph from among themselves. It quickly became clear that there were only 2 real contenders, the Prophet's cousin Ali bin Abi Talib and the Umayyad Uthman bin Affan. While both were early Muslims, Ali was irrepressibly anti-tribal, while Uthman came from the most elite clan of Quraysh. Uthman enjoyed such cordial relations with them that Muhammad would send him as the Ummah's representative to negotiate with Quraysh back before its conversion. The council deliberated for a while and ultimately selected Uthman as the next caliph, decisively shifting the social tension at the heart of the Ummah from the Islamic back to the tribal. It took a while for this shift to fully manifest, and even narrations critical of Uthman's 12-year reign say that the first 6 were fine. I believe this is just a symptom of the reticence to levy any criticism towards the Prophet's companions. Consider some of Uthman's earliest decrees. He rescinded Umar's travel restrictions on Quraysh, allowing its members to set up shop wherever they liked. He pardoned and promoted his kin, some of whom had been banished by the Prophet even after converting to Islam. Being accustomed to wealth, this generous financier of the Ummah during its most challenging years also became the first caliph to eschew a life of poverty. Umar's residence in Medina wasn't exactly a palace, but let's just say that there was a sharp contrast between his lifestyle and that of the austere Umar whom he'd succeeded. While there are others that we can bring up, let's focus on the consequences these changes had for the Ummah. Now that Quraysh's elites could go wherever they wanted, they and their allies mainly gravitated towards lands where Umayyads were in control of the administration, namely Syria and Egypt. This had a polarizing effect on the Ummah, as those with no ties to or no love for the tribal order found themselves more at ease in Iraq, where the Canton cities established by Umar at the edge of the desert maintained an egalitarian ethos. Members of the Ansar and those who had hoped for Ali's leadership of the Ummah thus made their way east to Kufa and Basra. I don't want it to sound like this was a natural or accidental process. The Umayyad governor of Syria, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, was very intentional about who was allowed in his lands, and Uthman relied greatly on his young nephew. In fact, whenever some troublemaker was identified anywhere in the realm, the caliph would order they be forwarded to Syria so Muawiyah could decide their fate. Similarly, If there was anyone in Syria whom Muawiyah didn't want around, he'd request that dear Uncle Uthman order their banishment. Such was the fate of the early companion of the Prophet Abu Dhur, who spent his time in Syria chastising Muawiyah for constructing palaces and living, quote, like a Caesar. This polarization may have set the stage for the civil conflict to come, but it was the Ummah's newfound wealth which provided its explosive potential. If the narration about him is to be believed, Omar was right to weep when he saw the treasures of the surrounding empires gushing into Medina, saying, quote, God had never sent a people such riches without destroying them. Uthman continued to make sure that the poor were supported, but there was so much money now that this cost was a tiny fraction of overall revenue. Taking the advice of the Umayyads he'd empowered, Omar chose to keep the remainder of the Ummah's wealth in a treasury in Medina so it could be used to finance the Caliphate's objectives. This wasn't necessarily bad policy. In fact, it reveals an administrative recognition that the Ummah was developing into a state, albeit a very rudimentary one. The real problem came from the way Uthman decided to spend this money. He believed it was his right as caliph to do with it as he saw fit, and seemed genuinely surprised when people protested at the prodigal gifts he made to his family. When challenged on why he was diverging from the examples set by his predecessors, Uthman simply replied that, quote, Omar and Abu Bakr sought God's approval by withholding from their kin. I seek it through generosity to them. His answer may seem dismissive at first glance, but it reveals that Uthman did not recognize the tension between the tribal and the Islamic. Now that everyone was Muslim, surely the Arabs could return to their long-held social norms. His administration was thus reviving the influence of the elites in a way very reminiscent of pre-Islamic society. Things came to a head after Uthman appointed his kin in charge of Iraq. Their shameless assertions about how its fertile lands were the gardens of Quraysh rightly enraged the Muslims, who saw Islam's egalitarianism as one of its core values. Bands of men from Iraq conspired with like-minded soldiers serving under the hapless Umayyad governor of Egypt and confronted Uthman. The people of Medina were initially supportive of this movement, viewing it as a necessary corrective to a weak caliph and his power-hungry kinsmen. One of the men from the Qurayshi council who had chosen Uthman to lead the Ummah all those years ago even openly supplied those rebels with food at no charge. Another refused to speak to the caliph when he came to visit him on his deathbed, turning his back to the Umayyad in a final act of defiance. The rebels appealed to Ali bin Abi Talib for help, and he did what he could to mediate between them and the caliph. While this seemed to work at first, when they accidentally found out that Uthman intended to not only retain his kin in leadership positions, but had orders to punish anyone involved in the rebellion, things turned ugly. The rebels laid siege to the caliph's residence in Medina, and after some blood was spilled, they broke in and brought his life to a violent end. The upstarts proceeded to pledge their loyalty to Ali, just as the elites they opposed rallied behind Muawiyah, who vowed to seek vengeance on his uncle's murder. With these developments, conditions were ripe for a showdown between the two organizational paradigms available to the early Ummah, the tribal and the Islamic, each championed by a different lord of Quraysh. Before we go any further, I'd like to try something my editor suggested. The Ummah is about to witness a momentous conflict, so I want to present you with a hypothetical figure from either side. Basically, I'm going to make up a couple people to illustrate how they ended up on either side of the war. Both these figures will be Arab men of no renown. The main difference between them is that one comes from a small, thus weak, tribe, and the other from a large and powerful one. As we've heard so far, smaller, weaker tribes were some of the Ummah's earliest converts to the new religion. They often had to contend with larger threats, and thus benefited greatly from the Ummah's promise of mutual defense. So, as a member of a small tribe, our hypothetical fellow, let's call him Saleh, would have been part of Islam when it was still at the outset of its journey. Saleh would have endured some of the Ummah's formative experiences with the other early adopters, perhaps even all three of its major wars against Quraysh and their allies. If so, Saleh surely would have interacted with the Prophet's close companions, and perhaps even Muhammad himself. If he stayed in Medina any length of time, he would have become deeply familiar with the Ansar. Saleh's experience at war up until the birth of the Caliphate would have been defending the Ummah from large Arab tribes that tried to destroy it in a bid to restore the old order. It is thus no surprise that when the first fitna rolled around, most of the early Muslims found themselves aligned with Ali bin Abi Talib and the Ansar. Our imaginary Saleh fits neatly within this group. Now for his counterpart. Let's call him Abdul Uzza, an idolatrous choice, as Uzza is both pride and the name of a pagan god. Abdul Uzza's tribe probably joined Islam late in the game, when large powerful tribes began to convert en masse following the conversion of the noble Quraysh. In line with Arab custom, his tribe's elder would have adopted the religion and thus declared all their kin to be Muslim as well. Abdul Uzza would thus have to change his name, so we'll now call him Abdul Rahman, as that proved to be an especially popular choice among the Arabs at this point. There is a chance that this Abdul Rahman would have seen Muhammad, but that was far less likely now that the Ummah had suddenly ballooned in size. Anyway, he only had a couple years before the Prophet passed away, and his companions succeeded him as caliphs. After that, Abdul Rahman fought alongside his own kin against Sassanid and Byzantine armies, winning great fortunes in the process. Islam may have redefined his tribe's relationship with other tribes, but Abdul Rahman's life remained fundamentally unchanged. His tribe still loomed very large in his life, mapping the pattern of his days, his social relationships, and much more beyond that. All this must have had a profound impact on Abdul Rahman's idea of Islam and its compatibility with tribal norms. To someone like him, the two must have seemed like they coexisted in perfect harmony. Abdul Rahman would have dutifully obliged his kin and leadership when they asked him to draw steel against other Muslims. The contest between Ali bin Abi Talib and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan lasted for almost 5 years, but the main event took place in the opening phase of that struggle. We can gain some valuable insights by taking a closer look at the Battle of Siffin. Now, the fighting itself is beside the point. I'm more interested in contrasting the tribal and Islamic leadership styles on display. Let's start with the armies. Muawiyah's forces were obedient and deferential to their leadership, while Ali's side was an unruly mass that was reluctant to fully engage and quick to turn on him. The unity and discipline of the Syrians wasn't some inherent virtue. It was clearly the result of Muawiyah's meticulous curating of the province's residents over his decades as its governor. He patiently cultivated ties with the leaders of the most influential Syrian tribes and encouraged his own clan's allies to establish themselves in the area as well. In managing this coalition, he displayed a masterful understanding of tribal politics, deploying bribes, promises, marriages, and of course, milking his own noble heritage for all it's worth. Ali bin Abi Talib faced an entirely different reality. He could rely on a sizable core of old-school Muslims, united through faith, willing to risk life and limb to fight for their ideals and brethren. It's difficult to estimate the size of this chunk, but it was certainly less than a quarter of his overall numbers. These were the only folks whose politics transcended the tribal. The rest of his supporters still existed within that system. Few tribes were entirely on board with Ali bin Abi Talib's mission, and most of them had clans who disagreed on the right course of action. This decision paralysis on the Iraqi side was exacerbated by Muawiyah's skillful politicking. We covered many narrations of missives he sent tribal elders to woo them to his side. These attempts would have been less successful had Ali engaged in the same arena. Ali's devotion to Islam's egalitarian ethos, however, was uncompromising, and he wouldn't even grant tribal elites his attention, let alone any special favors. While Muawiyah would communicate with a circle of tribal elders, who would then carry out his designs using chains of command with well-established legitimacy, Ali only ever addressed masses at the mosque, often decrying their lack of unity and tepid commitment to their faith. The thing with Ali's disdain for tribal politics was that it extended further than just the elites. He also refused to privilege the Arabs over other Muslims. Now granted, non-Arab converts only represented a tiny minority at this early stage, so it may not have been a major issue. But it is important in the sense that it portends the next conflict that will sit at the heart of the Ummah after this Islamic v. tribal one is settled. Ali repeatedly lectured his supporters about how God loved those who were most faithful to Muhammad's teachings, and new converts, typically destitute Persian slaves and outcasts, were often more genuine in their embrace of Islam than the tribal-minded Arabs who made up the bulk of his support. In one narration, we hear that when two Arab women suggested that Ali distribute food and wealth to the Arabs before the rest, he chided them and replied that their ethnicity did not make them any closer to God. This attitude surely alienated many folks and helped make Muawiyah's entreaties to the Arabs that much more appealing. There are actually a couple of tidbits from the Battle of Siffin that I think are worth mentioning before moving on, both from Ali's side. One is to validate the tribal v. Islamic perspective we've been using, the other to show the sort of confusion that prevailed on the Iraqi camp. We're told that one day during the battle, a soldier came up to Ali and asked how as caliph he could accept to see Muslim fighting against Muslim. The response came not from Ali, but from his trusted commander Yasir bin Ammar, who said to the young man, quote, "I was at Badr, the very first war between the Ummah and Quraysh. The men I fought alongside then and their children stand with us today, and the men we fought against and their children are still massed against us." According to this narration, the Battle of Siffin can rightly be characterized as a counter-revolution of the tribal against the Islamic, a Badr 2.0. The second story is similar, with a man telling Ali bin Abi Talib that he had had a dream of the two sides united in prayer and was struggling with how to justify taking the life of another Muslim. Ali's reply, perfectly consistent with his worldview, eschewed political considerations entirely. He said it did not matter what side one was on. Any man who gave his life fighting for what he believed in his heart was best for this world would be rewarded with heaven, while men on either side, who had no compunction about spilling blood for selfish gain, would be punished in the afterlife. And so we learn two things. Ali's spiritual guidance is high-minded and admirable, but also, again, completely unconcerned with the political. Secondly, it's telling that both instances of vacillating support come from the Iraqi side. The Syrians never questioned their tribal leaders, and avoided wrestling with the religious implications of this conflict the way that the Iraqis did. So just like how the Syrians were united not by virtue of their character, but the tribal system, the Iraqis were inclined towards religious introspection, also not due to any inherent spirituality, but rather because faith was the main thing they had in common. When push came to shove, faith proved to be a looser bond than blood. Ali's core supporters saw him as the fountainhead of religious opinion, but many on his side disagreed and eventually even abandoned him entirely. These were the Khawarij, and their dissent ultimately cost Ali his life when one of them struck the Prophet's cousin dead while he was bowed in prayer at the mosque. Muawiyah subsequently had an easy time picking apart the opposition, overcoming Ali's son Hassan and reuniting the Ummah under his auspices. But wait, there's more. While this may seem like the final triumph of the tribal over the Islamic, we're actually not there yet. Muawiyah's rule was very tribal indeed, but it still represented a compromise between these two poles. While his promise to pass the baton to Hassan or let the Ummah choose its next leader turned out to be hollow, it shows that Muawiyah understood that he had to tread carefully so as not to antagonize the sizable minority who remained apprehensive about the direction the caliphate was now heading in. He walked this line adeptly, slowly nudging the Ummah's social fabric towards the tribal during his long reign. Despite Muawiyah's careful efforts, the conflict with the Islamic erupted once again after he passed away, an avoidable situation that was entirely instigated by his son and heir. The issue of his succession was always going to be a touchy one, especially since Yazid would be the first Muslim to inherit power from his father. Many in the Ummah were outraged at the notion, and the most viable alternative to Muawiyah's son was Ali's. Now, Al-Hassan had already been assassinated by Muawiyah due to his political potency, so the Hashemite clan's supporters pinned their hopes on his younger brother Al-Hussein. He left Medina for Kufa, his father's base of operations during the conflict against the Umayyads, but was intercepted by the Caliphate's forces just outside the city. The massacre of the Hashemites at Karbala was an act of state violence that forever scarred the Ummah. I want to underscore that Yazid did not need to do any of this. In fact, it was terrible politics that won him way less than it cost. Eradicating the Prophet's bloodline rightly gets a lot of attention, but 3 years later he did the same to the Ansar, those early supporters of Muhammad who had received the Muslims when they first fled Meccan persecution. Umayyad forces crushed the Ansar at the Battle of Harra, right outside Medina, then proceeded to pillage the Prophet's city for 3 days, leading to the wanton slaughter of thousands. Yazid intentionally ordered these atrocities not due to political necessity, but out of a thirst for tribal vengeance. He disdained the early Muslims and blamed them for humiliating his clan and spilling Umayyad blood back in the day. During his reign, he asked poets to insult the Ansar, but all were scandalized at the caliph's request. Yazid thus relied upon Al-Akhtal, a Christian poet of stupendous talent, to skewer them in verse instead. And so the commander of the faithful was paying a Christian to attack the Muslims who warned that the Prophet's ways were being abandoned. You can't make this stuff up. Muawiyah had succeeded in preparing the caliphate for his son to such an extent that Yazid got away with all of this. The second fitna did not occur because the Ummah could not sit idly by and watch Muhammad's legacy be so vindictively picked apart. It only happened because Yazid's sudden death, followed by his sickly son's own demise, left the Umayyads without an heir. Even so, Muawiyah's vision for an Umayyad state was so sound that the Caliphate's tribal armies held repeated councils in search of another Qurayshi who could lead them. Sort of like how a cartoon zombie roots around for a head to plop atop its shoulders. Marwan and his son Abd al-Malik came along at the right time to fill that void. With the Syrians behind them, the second fitna now had 4 factions vying for political legitimacy in the Caliphate. We won't spend as much time on this one, but I encourage listeners to think of the first and second fitna as intimately connected, kind of like how the First and Second World Wars are regarded today. I find the tribal v Islamic lens is still viable, except the latter had fractured due to the pressures it had endured during the 2 decades of Umayyad rule. The massacres of the Hashemites and the Ansar, and Islam's adoption in Iraq had fundamentally altered the political landscape. Abdullah ibn Zubayr had the most support on the peninsula, and would have won the fitna by default if the Umayyads hadn't succeeded in resurrecting their dynasty. The third faction was led by al-Mukhtar in Iraq, a man who claimed to speak on behalf of the Hashemites. The fact that his support came almost entirely from newly converted Persians foreshadows the tensions that will plague the Ummah down the line. By Persians, I just mean ex-Sassanid subjects, not specifically people from the province of Faris. They had been drawn to Islam by its purported egalitarianism, something which had briefly been practiced in its earliest days, then again during Ali bin Abi Talib's 5 years in Iraq. His equitable treatment of these converts was never forgotten. Instead, it was valorized as having been true to the prophetic tradition. As a consequence, the Hashemite name had such strong purchase among these converts that even an unknown quantity like al-Mukhtar could mobilize sufficient support to become a contender in this volatile time for the Ummah. The fourth, final, and least relevant faction in this fitna were the Kharijites, and their disunity meant that they never really stood a chance. The most they could hope for was a brief period of self-rule while the other 3 battled for supremacy. After several years of war, the Umayyads eventually came out on top. But there are a couple things we can learn from the defeat of the other 2 serious contenders. Ibn Zubayr failed to capitalize on his early advantage because he refused to leave the peninsula or engage with the rudderless Syrian power base. Al-Mukhtar's supporters were shamelessly betrayed and massacred by Ibn Zubayr's brother, without a peep in our sources decrying the Muslim-on-Muslim violence. The lessons of the second fitna are clear. The Ummah had largely reverted to its tribal roots, and non-Arab converts were considered at best as second-class Muslims, at worst as infiltrators who ought to be purged lest they corrupt the faith. The victorious Abd al-Malik accepted everyone's pledges and prepared to lead his tribal Arab caliphate to greater heights. He hammered in the point in a speech he gave at Medina after completing his first pilgrimage as caliph. He said, and I quote, "I am not like the weak caliph, the guileful caliph, or the dreadful caliph," meaning Uthman, Muawiyah, and Yazid respectively. "I swear to right this ummah's path with my sword. You learn the ways of the early Muslims but fall short of their example. You demand their piety from us and forget yourselves. By God, I will strike the neck of whomever faults my piety after this day." With Abd al-Malik's proclamation, we can finally let go of our first explanatory framework, the tribal versus the ideological. The tension between the two persisted, but with the state so firmly on one side, it stops being such a useful angle for interpreting the Ummah's political dynamics. Every subsequent caliph bar one followed Abd al-Malik's example in seeing the political legitimacy of their office as independent of their religious conduct. With the exception of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, None aspired to manifest Muhammad-style piety. Their legitimacy sprang from the noble tribal lineage of the Umayyad clan. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the exception to the Umayyad rule, is often fondly referred to as the fifth of the Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs, a way of connecting him to the Ummah's first four leaders. Our sources like to contrast his simple and reverent lifestyle to the kingly pretensions of his kin, but it's Umar's policy changes that vindicate our juxtaposition of the tribal and Islamic. He initiated deep reforms which reversed many of the caliphate's policies during his 2 years in power. Edicts his successor immediately rescinded following Umar's untimely and unexplained demise. But as I was saying, Abdul Malik's rise to power spelled the beginning of a new phase in the Ummah's journey, one that can't be explained by contrasting the tribal and Islamic. Instead of immediately jumping into the next decisive tension, how about we try to describe the new state of affairs more generally, so as to capture some of the major ways it differed from what came before? The most obvious change could be seen in government. The caliphate didn't truly develop into a state until Abdul Malik's reign. He established mints, postal routes, tax collection offices, and other institutions we'd consider requisite of a sovereign nation. It's true that the caliph had Muawiyah's military and bureaucratic vision as a base to build off of, but his structured administration made what came before seem freewheeling and unfocused by comparison. Let's not restrict our attention to the state, though. After all, Abdul Malik's realm was demographically very different from, say, Abu Bakr's. In its earliest days, the Ummah was comprised entirely of nomadic Arab tribes. Their victories over the two empires that had constricted them to their desert peninsula meant they now ruled over a host of different communities. This change brought the Arabs challenges that they were ill-equipped to deal with. The Ummah was barely a generation old, and it now had to find ways to govern both itself and others. The Umayyad formulation drew greatly from the tribal political imagination, something that helped it resonate with the Arabs and made it seem like an indigenous response to their new circumstances. The tribal system was retained wholesale, of course, with Quraysh and the ruling clan firmly in the center as the noblest and best-connected Arabs. Upward mobility in the Ummah was no longer a function of devotion to Islam, but achieved through the classic method of establishing ties with powerful clans through fealty or matrimony. So far, so familiar. When it came to the conquered populations, Umayyad policies worked towards keeping them apart from the Ummah proper. The Arabs were encouraged to maintain their nomadic ways, and those who chose to lead a settled life overwhelmingly did so in newly founded cities like Basra, Kufa, and Fustat, not among pre-existing communities. After all, it was a lot easier for the Umayyads to monitor and control the Arabs so long as they stuck to their tribes. But this enforced separation brought with it another important benefit. It helped stabilize the caliphate's finances. See, up until this point, the main revenue stream feeding the treasury was war booty. Now that the caliphate had stopped expanding, this was replaced with taxes collected from settled populations. Arabs were exempted from taxation, and so allowing them to live among the tax base would only disrupt those societies, lowering the overall productivity and income. It's worth noting that from the perspective of these settled populations, the caliphate's tax burdens were a whole order lower than what the empires before them had demanded. Taxes on non-Muslims living in the Umayyad realm started out as low as a single gold coin per man per year. This partly explains the lightning speed with which the Arab conquests progressed. Coupled with their relatively light taxes, their willingness to allow communities to govern themselves so long as they disarmed meant that many viewed the Arabs as liberators from imperial subjugation. Taken together, these Umayyad policies made the Arabs the only armed group in a population that outnumbered them somewhere between 5 and 10 to 1. With a firm monopoly on violence, they became a sort of military caste that ruled over and subsisted off of those living under their protection. Considering the parallels between this relationship and how the nomadic Arabs treated their herds, we can see that yet again the Umayyads did not have to stray very far from their inherited tribal political imagination. In their caliphate, the Arabs were to be shepherds looking after human flocks. This was the idealized vision, at least. But there was one trifling matter that undermined this separation that the Umayyads strove to instill between the umma and the folks in its charge: Islam. While Muhammad had spent his life preaching to the Arabs, the God he described to them was universal. The Umayyads had no interest in converting any of the communities they had conquered. Quite the opposite, in fact. They couldn't go so far as to forbid non-Muslims from adopting Islam, and so instead they discouraged the practice by not recognizing new converts as members of the Ummah in any meaningful way. If they were free men, they still had to pay their taxes. If they were slaves, then they remained in bondage. And either way, they were excluded from Arab mosques. These othering policies may have come from the top, but it's also fair to say that a majority of Arabs adhered to similarly exclusionary definitions and attitudes. At this stage, the Ummah still understood Islam to be a strictly Arab religion, despite some of its earliest adherents being descendants of other races. Among Muhammad's close companions were Bilal, Salman, and Suhaib, who were respectively Ethiopian, Persian, and Byzantine. The merciless purging of the Mawali during the Second Fitna instead clearly shows that the compunctions against spilling Muslim blood did not extend to non-Arabs. Over 6,000 of them surrendered following the death of their leader, al-Mukhtar, only to be executed en masse. While the Arabs issued blanket pardons to any community that laid down its arms, these new Muslims were denied such clemency. They were not a military threat, but their demands that the Arabs treat them as equals crossed a line by implying that the Arabs would have to share their power with those who adopted their new faith. This isn't just going to be a long-term problem for the Umayyad Caliphate. It's going to be the long-term problem. At the outset of their reconstituted dynasty, the conflict between the Iraqis and Syrians took center stage, then the one against the Khawarij. All the while the Hashemites posed a perennial threat, as did the intra-Arab feuding between the Qahtani and Adnani tribes. But when the Abbasid Da'wah finally brought the dynasty down, it was with the help of the Mawali. The ex-Sassanid converts to Islam grew fed up with the state's hypocrisy and the heavy-handedness of Arab overlordship. But before we start pulling on the thread that leads to the unraveling of Umayyad authority, let's examine where conversion to Islam was prevalent and why. It should be clear by now that the Caliphate considered non-Arab Muslims an inconvenience and did what it could to discourage conversion. We find a precious few exceptions to this rule, mainly the tribal confederations that roamed the Syrian and Iraqi deserts, and the nomadic tribes further north in Mesopotamia. Outside of those, we only come across scattered mentions of conversions at this early stage, making such narrations seem out of place and thus difficult to put much stock in. For example, in a prisoner exchange following a siege of Alexandria, we're told that the Arabs offered every man being released the option of adopting Islam, and celebrated whenever one accepted. Every now and then, we'll come across a narration about some theological debate in which the clever Muslim's riposte leads his interlocutor to recognize the superiority of Islam and seek conversion. Apart from such transparently propagandistic material, we don't find much evidence for any enduring effort to spread the faith. Ultimately, there was little reason for Jews and Christians to convert. The Caliphate's power was uncontested in the ex-Byzantine provinces of Egypt and Syria, and the state had an easy time ensuring social stability. Perhaps even more importantly, Islam recognized the validity of Judaism and Christianity as Abrahamic faiths, and Muslims expected to live in a world that was populated with Jews and Christians. Things were very different in the East. Not only was Zoroastrianism absent from the Abrahamic, and therefore Muslim, imagination, but the collapse of the Sassanid state had left things in disarray. Even before the empire's downfall, Zoroastrianism, its official religion, seems to have been primarily administered and practiced by the elites. Furthermore, the early Muslims and Hashemites who fled Umayyad persecution east spread with them an idealized, egalitarian vision of Islam. This led some to believe that by embracing the religion, they would come to be seen as full-fledged members of the Ummah. Some converted out of faith, but most probably did to eke out a living working among the Arabs, who forbade non-Muslims from entering their towns. It's ironic how a policy put in place to keep foreigners separate ends up driving them to adopt Islam instead. We have to resist the temptation to just focus on the Mawali and their toppling of the Umayyads. Since all that action takes place in the east, I feel it shortchanges the rest of the Caliphate. I want to correct for that a bit. Somewhat surprisingly, the Arab Peninsula doesn't really get a lot of attention. The Umayyads dominated Syria and made it central to their entire society, something which alienated those who stayed behind. There weren't as many armed rebellions as there were in Iraq, but the people of the peninsula were clearly estranged from the rest of the state. Tribes sometimes did turn to anti-state ideologies, Kharijite or Hashemite, but this happened infrequently, and often on the fringes of the desert, in coastal or mountainous areas like Oman and Yemen. Another interesting geography that gets shortchanged is Africa, the north of which the Arabs managed to conquer with incredible speed. Their armies, norms, even their new religion were all well suited to the nomadic lifestyle of the Berber tribes inhabiting the north. Despite the similarities between the Arabs and the Berbers, the Muslims did not seek to share their new faith with these locals as they had with the nomads in Syria, Iraq, and Mesopotamia. Because of this, it took Islam over 4 centuries to become the majority religion in northern Africa. There weren't as many settled Christian communities west of Egypt, and that area wasn't lucrative, which explains why the Umayyads didn't see the region as a priority. As elsewhere, settled folks were mostly left to govern themselves so long as they paid their taxes and did not collude with the Byzantines. The Caliphate asserted its political control over those lands, and by fighting alongside the Berbers, its commanders even managed to conquer the Iberian Peninsula. One remarkable thing about these lightning advances is that they happened without a great deal of intentionality from the central government. Africa was too distant for the Umayyads to properly manage from Damascus, and so a different Qurayshi dynasty ran everything west of Tunis. Success in northern Africa both pleased and perturbed the ruling clan, but it never got to the point where they felt threatened, really. Maybe only when the Iberian invasion first proved a surprising success. The commander who conquered Spain is a celebrated figure today, but for his overreach, he was recalled to the Umayyad capital and at the very least kept under house arrest. Some narrations suggest he met a worse fate, but all agree that the son he left in charge back west was assassinated within a year. One area that gets ignored almost entirely in our histories is sub-Saharan Africa. I had to turn to modern sources whenever I was curious to learn more about the impact left on it by the sudden emergence of the Caliphate. The Arabs faced fierce resistance on the battlefield when they tried invading back in pre-dynastic days, so they gave up on sending armies. During the Umayyad dynasty, They mostly accessed sub-Saharan Africa by sailing from Yemen to either Sudan, Ethiopia, or further south, what our sources call Zanzibar. A small number of local tribes along the coast adopted Islam, and the Arabs employed them as slavers, formally or otherwise. Over the 1400 years between the advent of Islam and the 21st century, more than 13 million Africans were sold into slavery, on par with the European slave trade, which started in the 16th century. What's especially egregious is how religion was twisted to justify this abhorrent practice. Though I suppose it is naive to find that surprising, and the exact same thing happened when Christianity came to the continent's western coast centuries later. A sharp contrast between the two experiences with slavery can be found in gender. Europeans sought laborers for their colonial plantations, and they enslaved twice as many men as they did women. The Arabs went in the opposite direction, had more of a market for women than they did men. One of the narrations quoted by Ahmad Amin in his trilogy on Islam describes how slave girls of different ethnicities were considered suited for different things. Slavs and Berbers were often favored over Arabs, but the narration also discusses Armenians, Turkic women, Indians, and more. When it came to sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopian women were praised for their skill at keeping house and raising children, while Sudanese women made excellent dancers and percussionists and were known for their shiny white teeth. One facet of Arab history that I feel remains woefully underexplored is the impact female slavery had on the toxic attitudes towards girls and women, ones that remain virulent to this day across our societies. I mean, the only difference between a slave girl and a wife is that you could buy and sell the former, at least until she got pregnant, at which point she literally became your wife, legally, religiously, and socially. If human bondage poisoned the West by instilling a false sense of racial supremacy, for the umma it reinforced a harmful attitude of gender supremacy. The final stop on our tour is Asia Minor, or the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire. The Arabs only began to distinguish between Armenians and Romans after they'd conquered Armenia. They didn't really know what to make of the Khazars, and had no explanation for why they stopped attacking the Caliphate from across the Caspian. The war the Arabs waged against the empire quickly defined the border between the two powers, one that shifted remarkably little over the coming centuries. The Arabs did manage to puncture deep into Byzantine territory on several occasions. The failed invasion during Sulayman ibn Abdul Malik's reign is the closest they got to the Roman capital, but our sources describe the campaign as so badly managed that it seemed doomed from the outset. That's probably the benefit of hindsight, though. I'm sure it was terrifying for the citizens of Constantinople at the time. Ultimately, however, for 2 years all the Arabs managed to do was lose their navy, pillage the countryside, fail to lay siege to the city's impregnable walls, and die in large numbers. If you're wondering why a caliphate that protected Christian communities in its own lands would seek the destruction of its Christian neighbors, then keep in mind that conquering each other is pretty much all that empires are about. Even though the war was justified on religious or ideological grounds on both sides, it was just plain old imperial statecraft, akin to the conflicts between older regional powers like the Greeks and the Persians. Speaking of the Persians, this is a good time to turn to the east and see how the dynasty's policy there eventually led to its doom. Iraq presented an early problem for the new administration, as its population had sided against the Umayyads during both fitnas. Its Arabs had either supported Ibn Zubayr or broke away from the Ummah, becoming Kharijites. The cities also had tens of thousands of the Mawali, non-Arab converts, a demographic found in such numbers nowhere else in the Caliphate. In fact, narrations from the time reveal that the Arabs spoke of 2 Iraqs, Iraq al-Arab and Iraq al-Ajam, Arab Iraq, and foreign Iraq. These foreign Muslims formed the base of support for the Hashemite pretender al-Mukhtar. Their political aspirations were for a state that accepted them as equals, a non-starter for the Arabs generally and the Umayyads especially. I think this is another good point to conjure up a couple more hypothetical guys to illustrate the sort of social tension we're describing. This time, they won't be Arabs, but let's say a Syrian Christian, Paulus or Bulus, and a non-Arab native of Iraq, Saman. Bulus may have felt some trepidation at the arrival of the Arabs, but if he was like the majority of his neighbors, he would have been glad to see the Byzantines depart. They'd considered Eastern Christians like himself heretics and forced unpopular doctrines upon them. The Caliphate brought an end to that persecution, and although he was now at the mercy of the Arabs, they didn't force him to fight their wars and taxed him way less than the Byzantines had. Best of all, they didn't settle among his people, and they allowed his church to continue administering things as before. Bulus could even work for some Arabs as a translator if he knew Greek, Aramaic, and Arabic, or serve as a doctor or poet, or any craft that might interest the powerful of the Ummah. Saman's pre-Islamic life was nowhere near as well preserved. The fall of the Sassanid Empire brought a time of great calamity, especially in his neck of the woods, the settled areas closest to the desert, chief among them the old capital of Ctesiphon. Without the Shahanshah, these areas had little hope of sustaining themselves through the disruption of their age. The Arabs had founded 2 canton cities that quickly grew in size and offered new opportunities. There was a catch, though. You had to be Muslim to be allowed into Basra or Kufa. In order to convert, Saman had to find a sponsor willing to teach him the new religion, something which often entailed an obligation of service. Let's say Saman was a great blacksmith, so he found a gig working in that capacity for an Arab tribe in the city. He had to fulfill their requests for free, and they got a cut of any work he got outside of that arrangement. In return, they'd allow him to stay in the city by vouching for him as one of their loyalists, or mawali. There was another catch, though. Other Arabs looked down on Saman as an unwelcome interloper, or worse, a parasite. Even though he had converted and was now a Muslim, he was not allowed to pray in the Arab mosque. Saman was also taxed like a non-Muslim. Mawali like him were treated harshly, not just with disdain, but a suspicion of being a dangerous fifth column. A self-fulfilling prophecy if there ever was one. For governor of Iraq, Abdul Malik picked al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, the most ruthless man he could think of. Al-Hajjaj said as much the first time he addressed the Iraqis, in a speech that has been etched into Arab memory ever since. I'm not even exaggerating. Last year, a friend complained to me that when she mentioned that she was Iraqi to an inquiring shopkeeper at an Arab grocery store, he spontaneously replied, "Ah, the people of strife and hypocrisy." A direct quote from al-Hajjaj. His whole proclamation is a little too long to relay, but I'll do a bit of it to give you a general idea. O people of Iraq, your skulls have ripened and I am here for the harvest. By God, I can already see the blood flowing between your turbans and beards. People of Iraq, the commander of the faithful, Abdul Malik, spilled his quiver before him, and he tested his arrows one by one. Having found me to be the firmest and sharpest, he drew me into his bow and shot you. It goes on with threats of beating them like wild camels, accusations of heresy, and more, but you get the point. This was no egalitarian caliphate. The Iraqis were about to be dominated. At the end of his speech, al-Hajjaj informed those in Kufa that they had 3 days to join the armies going east, Anyone who disobeyed would be put to death. The governor bullied the population into submission throughout his entire 20-year tenure, employing various coercive methods. He founded a canton city midway between Kufa and Basra and filled it with Syrian troops so they could keep the two other cities in check. Despite, and because of, all the measures he took, Iraq rebelled against Umayyad rule again and again, though never successfully. Exhaustion did eventually set in, and the frequency of the uprisings decreased. But the severity of the Umayyad punishments only added to Iraqi grievances against the dynasty. Al-Hajjaj was around so long that his governorship spanned Abdul Malik's foundational reign into his son Al-Walid's. It was during the end of his term that another Arab figure rose to prominence in the east, that of the military commander Qutayba ibn Muslim. Qutayba was the one to consolidate Arab rules over faraway lands in Transoxiana like Tukharistan, Bukhara, and Khawarizm. Due to his many conquests, the locals came to call him the King of the Arabs. He accomplished all this by doing something no commander had done before. He imposed troop levies on the communities he pacified, refreshing his forces with every victory. Qutayba's novel military policy violated the Umayyad paradigm, though. It allowed non-Arabs to serve in the Caliphate's armies. This mixing only encouraged conversion in the east, and with it demands and expectations for equitable treatment. It didn't last very long, though, for Qutayba fell out of favor as soon as Sulayman rose to power following Al-Walid's death. He tried to rebel against Umayyad authority, but was quickly put down by his Arab soldiers. The incoming commander disbanded the foreign troops, and without them the Arabs lost control over much of the region. There's a valuable lesson in Qutayba's downfall. He was caught up in the conflict between the Qahtani and Adnani coalitions that made up the bulk of the Caliphate's armies. Sulayman was less adept at balancing the two than his brother and father before him, and he earned a reputation for bias. His selection as caliph led to a changing of the guard, and Qutayba just happened to be on the wrong side. This sort of exchange of command positions rarely involved violence in and around Syria, but the further one was from the capital province, the more dangerous it became. It took months for messages to arrive to Maru, the Arab capital of Khurasan, and that isolation gave its governors a feeling of pseudo-independence. Sudden and extreme shifts in state policy thus presented tempting opportunities for them to try and break away. This is important because the next few caliphs oscillated between the two poles of the Qahtani-Adnani feud, something that went down fine in Syria, but was very destabilizing all the way out east. Anyway, after Sulayman we get Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the Umayyad exception. He was the only dynastic caliph to call for a return to the Prophet's ways. You know, in Arabic, the Prophet's way is Sunnat Rasulullah, which is what the word Sunnah is in reference to. Using this technical definition, Umar can be considered the first Sunni Umayyad. Most people think that if you're not Shia, then you're Sunnah, but that's just lazy thinking. In any case, neither of those two sects had formed yet, so I guess it's sort of a moot point. Seeking to emulate his maternal grandfather, the second caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, this Umar refused to lead a life of luxury. He left the city behind and moved around with a small posse, spending his days in prayer and sleeping in a tent. He totally rejected the established Umayyad model and made some radical changes. He ended the mandatory cursing of the Hashemites at the mosques, a policy that had been in place since the first fitna. Even more explosively, he decreed that all Muslims must be treated equally regardless of their race. When his administrators complained that such a move would ruin their finances, he replied that God had sent Muhammad as a messenger not a tax collector. Most governors in the East downright refused to enact those changes, and they didn't have to resist central authority for long, because the caliph died around 2 years after he came to the throne, and power passed back into the hand of his cousins, the sons of Abdul Malik. Next up came Yazid, who changed everything back to the way it was before Omar became caliph. Apart from that, Yazid just liked to party and pursue vendettas. He was just as biased as Sulayman. He was also as biased as Sulayman, except to the Adnanis instead of the Qahtanis. His reign meant that leadership positions changed hands once again, something which led to rebellions and bloodshed and all that. Yazid ruled for a few years, then passed away, making way for the only impressive son of Abdul Malik to lead the Ummah, Hisham. This caliph arrived at a crucial time for his dynasty, as successive short-sighted Umayyads had left the clan in a very weak position. He shored up their authority all over the realm. In the east, he did so by empowering Nasr ibn Sayyar, a commander whose strong connection with the locals made him beloved in Khurasan. Nasr reformed the tax system to assuage their grievances and treated them like he did his fellow Arabs. Only under his leadership could the Arabs retake the lands they'd lost after Qutayba's removal, proving that control of the East literally could not happen without the willing participation of at least some of its native inhabitants. Although Nasr was reconfirmed in his position by Hisham's successor, support from the central authority diminished considerably as the new generation of Umayyad rulers became distracted with indulgent lifestyles and political intrigues. Al-Walid ibn Yazid ruled for a little over a year before he was deposed by his cousin. Yazid ibn Walid reigned for less than half of that before dying of a sudden illness. His brother Ibrahim was in charge for a measly 3 months before the Umayyad governor of Armenia, bin Marwan, overthrew him in what he claimed was a bid to restore order to the realm. He spent the next 4 years putting down his many enemies, depleting the Syrian power base the Umayyads traditionally relied upon, just in time for the Abbasid Dawah to bear fruit and bring its armies crashing in from the east. Marwan marshaled every soldier he could muster to face the threat in northern Iraq. He couldn't wait for them in Syria, because the Arabs of Kufa and Basra had already declared their support for the revolution. The Umayyads' defeat spelled the end of the dynasty. Hundreds of his kin died in battle that day, while he and the rest were hunted down in the opening years of the Abbasid age. The prospect of understanding the Abbasid revolution was a real motivation for me when I first considered reading these early histories. Its success marked a new era as the incoming dynasty made some fundamental changes to the caliphate, and I looked forward to getting more insight into how it happened and why it succeeded. Were the Umayyads asleep at the wheel? Was it more of a Syrian versus Iraqi thing? Did the Umayyad life of luxury upset a pious ummah? What exactly was the mysterious da'wah? We'll get to the reasons for its success, but we have to start with the da'wah, as it planted the seed out of which the revolution grew. The official Abbasid version of the story dwells on unlikely details that legitimize the clan's right to call for the ummah's leadership, allegedly bestowed upon them through one of Ali bin Abi Talib's descendants. I'm not interested in getting into that today. I'd rather marvel at the simplicity of the da'wah instead, which cast itself as a project of religious restoration. In order to make sure they could never be replaced by a rival Qurayshi clan, the Umayyads kept a close eye on all possible contenders. Most clans didn't really stand a chance. The true rivals were the ones more closely related to the Prophet than the Umayyads. The Abbasids fell into that category, and as a result, their movement was restricted by the state. They were not allowed to leave Greater Syria, and so they resided outside a small trading post in southern Jordan. Facing this considerable disadvantage, the Abbasids could not openly oppose the Umayyads. Their communications and associations were monitored, making it risky for them to even covertly argue for legitimacy or agitate against the state. If some rabble-rouser ever called for them to ascend to power, they would immediately be neutralized for posing a threat to the Umayyads. Instead of giving up, though, the Abbasids chose to play the long game. They secretly funded a network of preachers and tasked them with encouraging calls for returning power to the Prophet's blood. The genius of this strategy is twofold. Such demands predated the dynastic age, so the launch and growth of this project did not arouse any Umayyad suspicion until it was already quite mature. Secondly, the intentional vagueness of calling for the Prophet's kin directed all the state's ire towards the Hashemites, who had always been seen as the true threat to Umayyad rule. Nobody saw the Abbasids coming. By the time the Umayyads realized that they had been involved with the Da'wah, its armies had already taken Khurasan and were fast approaching. Later on, we even find narrations about Iraqi Arabs who were surprised and dismayed when the victors refused to hand power to their Hashemite cousins. The Abbasids had fooled both their opponents and their supporters. The Da'wah succeeded entirely due to its strategic ambiguity. Different groups had various beefs with the Umayyads, and each of them supported the revolution because of their own particular grievances. Hashemite supporters had their reasons, the Iraqis had their reasons, anti-dynastic ideologues had their reasons, and so on. All of these were important because they brought Arab buy-in to the revolution. At its core, however, it was a Perso-Khurasani insurrection. It would have never succeeded without Arab support. Just like how the Arabs couldn't conquer the East without working with the natives, the people of the East couldn't topple the Umayyads without a good chunk of the Arabs on board. But that didn't make it an Arab revolution by any stretch of the imagination. Had the Abbasids failed, I'm sure the Da'wah would have gone into the records as just another in a long line of thwarted Persian plots against the Caliphate. Its self-identification as a movement to restore the state to the service of Islam and the Ummah would have been considered the sort of hollow window dressing necessary to conceal its nefarious ends. Another clue to its fundamentally Eastern nature is that the Khurasani element was such a major component of the new regime that the Abbasids focused on containing it as soon as they were done with their Umayyad kin. The first caliph, As-Saffah, the Slaughterous, got his title from a speech in which he swore to be a renowned bloodletter, and indeed much of his reign was spent hunting down Umayyads and desecrating their burial grounds. Upon succeeding As-Saffah, his brother Al-Mansur immediately turned his attention towards Abu Muslim, leader of the Khurasani forces, a figure our sources struggle to describe convincingly. Crucially, though, the caliph didn't try to remove the Khurasanis entirely, just their leadership, to ensure their loyalty was not contested. Once Abu Muslim was neutralized, the caliph embraced the Khurasanis and turned his attention to what he considered the last real threat to the new dynasty: the Hashemites. We didn't discuss the Prophet's clan when we were talking about the Umayyad dynasty earlier. The massacre at Karbala was their epochal moment. It redefined both the clan's organization and its place in the Ummah. Of Ali bin Abi Talib's 2 children by the Prophet's daughter, the descendants of Al-Hassan encouraged or engaged in sporadic rebellions against the Umayyads, while the surviving progeny of Al-Hussein took on roles as imams and religious educators in Mecca and Medina. The ruling clan kept a close watch on both of those branches, but their grip on the Hashemites loosened along with their grip on power in their last few years in charge. This coincided with the leadership of Ja'far as-Sadiq, arguably the greatest political and religious mind of all of Ali bin Abi Talib's descendants. Using the unprecedented freedom he enjoyed, the Imam managed to build a huge following in the holy cities, making him far more influential than any Hashemite had ever been in the dynastic age. It was Ja'far who first formalized a system of beliefs that eventually came to set the Shia apart from the Sunnah ideologically. His introduction of the concept of the divine spark, which was passed on from father to son through the Hashemite bloodline, recast the concept of legitimacy. The Arab practice of pledging loyalty was meant to sanction power through the people's voice, meaning legitimacy had to be bestowed by the people, freely or otherwise. The divine spark didn't care what the Arabs did, though. It implied a divinely ordained legitimacy that could either be correctly recognized or blasphemously denied. Over several centuries, Ja'far as-Sadiq's formulation came to be the common denominator of Shia jurisprudence. During his lifetime, it was just a novel way of articulating the Hashemite position. While Ja'far provided the ideas that eventually defined the Shia as a religious sect, his time was one when the Sunnah were clamoring for exactly the same thing: a return to Islamic leadership. The Sunnah may not have insisted on a Hashemite leading the Ummah, but in Muhammad the Pure Soul, they saw a man who would try to live up to the example set by the Prophet. His movement was supported by all the founding scholars of the surviving Sunni schools of thought. Furthermore, 3 of the 4 founders were themselves students of Ja'far as-Sadiq, and the 4th a student of one of them. The Hashemite elder did not support his kin's rebellion, which itself was quashed by the new Abbasid state with relative ease. Al-Mansur tried to force Ja'far as-Sadiq to relocate to his new capital and join his administration afterwards, but the Hashemite somehow managed to survive refusing the caliph. He was allowed to return to Medina, where he passed away a few years later. None of his descendants ever enjoyed a political climate as favorable as he had in the twilight years of the Umayyads. Indeed, the Abbasids were even harsher to their Hashemite kin than the previous dynasty had been. The Hashemites suffered greatly at the hands of the caliphate's new rulers, and their line of holy men was ultimately extinguished during the Abbasid era. That's the order in which the Abbasids took out their enemies then. First Umayyad, then Khurasani, and finally Hashemite. With all 3 defeated, Al-Mansur felt he finally had the leeway he needed to reshape the caliphate in his own image. He elevated his trusted Khurasani supporters above other elements of the Ummah, something which earned their armies the moniker Abna ad-Dawla, or Sons of the State. The caliph gifted them land by his new administrative capital, which he founded some 50 miles north of the ex-Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon. The round city of peace, Madinat as-Salam, proved the soundness of his new vision for the state. Baghdad, as it would come to be known, quickly grew into the world's largest city, a spot it retained for over 2 centuries. It became the first human settlement with a population exceeding 1 million, making it an unmatched center of commerce, culture, and science in its day. I mentioned that Al-Mansur was partial to the Khurasanis, but he also really hated Arabs. I didn't stress this during our coverage of his reign, as at the time I was a bit more skeptical of narrations that focused on his animosity. I felt like they were driven by retrospective bitterness and blame for the disempowerment of the Arabs, and as such were perhaps exaggerated. Boy, is there a lot of them, though. He was once devastated to find out that one of his favorite servants was Arab, and felt compelled to let him go. His administration was basically shorn of Arabs, who largely appeared at his court as entertainers, not officials. The reconstituted state thus represented the triumph of the Mawali over the Arabs. It's true that many of them had been avid participants in the Abbasid revolution, but the new status quo left the Arabs with very little influence over the Caliph. Unlike the Umayyads, the Abbasids had no need for cultivating patronage networks and marital ties with other tribes, as there was no reason to fear them. The loyal Abna gave al-Mansur the ability to take out any wayward tribes, presenting their elders with little choice but to comply with the state's demands. Looking back, this era was the nicest one to cover. I don't just mean al-Mansur's time, but the next century or so. It also worked well for our format. Since the Abbasid Caliph was meant to be power incarnate, narrating history by focusing on their person is most justified when we have such definitively influential individuals. Another explanation could be that these histories were written in the Middle Abbasid age. They both disparage the Umayyads and look back fondly at the dynasty's golden beginnings. A different source could have certainly provided us with a very different outlook. For example, Andalusian histories, written much later, were often produced under Umayyad patronage, and they predictably praise the Syrian dynasty and depict its caliphs very favorably. With the completion of al-Mansur's vision, the Ummah reached yet another milestone in its social progression. Now that the Arab versus Mawali tension had been settled in favor of the challengers, we can let go of that perspective. The Arabs regained some control during Harun al-Rashid's time, only to lose to the Khurasanis again shortly afterwards. The Turks come in later and replace both elements. All of this may sound like more of the same ethnic fighting we've just been describing, but upon closer inspection, you'll find that these struggles are fundamentally different. They are of a medieval state leviathan, asserting itself upon its populace. So if we wanted to abandon nuance, to sum things up real short, the Ummah's evolution looks like this. Under the rightly guided caliphs, it was empowered and run by pious Arab Muslims. Under the Umayyads, piety was jettisoned for its political inconvenience, and power was restricted to Arab Muslims. Finally, in the Abbasid age, the preference for Arabs was dropped, and the caliphate was fair game for all Muslims. I don't mean to imply that it had achieved any kind of egalitarianism. That was never the aim. Rather, now that the Arabs had risen to power by riding the wave of Mawali discontent, it became clear that any Muslim force capable of sustaining a supreme monarch could become the caliphate's favored element. We're going to investigate the Abbasid age through such a lens. We'll look at how and why power jumped between the different power bases that supported a caliph in office. The period we covered saw Abbasid influence rise and fall 3 times before the caliph's role was emptied of all executive authority. These 3 iterations of state power weren't identical, and as we go through them, we'll take note of the steady social progress exhibited by the Ummah as it went through these changes. The first incarnation of the powerful Abbasid state was the one founded by al-Mansur, and it lasted a little over 2 generations. We already mentioned his preference for Persians. He expressed it again by basing his son and heir al-Mahdi in Rai, near modern-day Tehran. It was there that al-Mahdi grew close to the Baramika, officials who came from Zoroastrian priestly roots. Their grasp of statecraft and strong relationships with the East made them ideal partners in administration, and they helped the Abbasid state prosper as they were steadily entrusted with more power and responsibility. The Baramika became invaluable to the caliphate, and their downfall under Harun al-Rashid marked a real shift in the fortunes of the state. There are 2 related themes, and one unconnected one, that I feel are important to bring up when discussing the celebrated Harun al-Rashid. It still vexes me that he enjoys such a stellar reputation, but we'll notice how the last caliph of each of the 3 cycles of Abbasid power is remembered in disproportionately glowing terms. It's jarring every time, because the reader can clearly trace how problems during their reigns led to the subsequent calamities. But I suppose this is what we get with histories that rely on oral accounts and narrations. Anyway, the 2 related themes I'd like to explore are the steady Arabization of the state during al-Rashid's reign and the unprecedented cooperation of religious figures with his administration. The unrelated one is the Book of Songs. Good Harun al-Rashid was never meant to take the throne. His brother al-Hadi was their father's designated heir, and he would have succeeded in killing Harun if he himself didn't suddenly perish in what some claim were mysterious circumstances. I don't really buy into that. I think al-Hadi got sick and died. But I must acknowledge the existence of rumors suggesting his mother, Khayzuran, killed him because she preferred her other son Harun. These rumors are reinforced by the fact that al-Khayzuran effectively ran the caliphate with the help of the Baramika until her death in the 3rd year of Harun's reign. Good Harun al-Rashid started out on great terms with the Baramika, and there are several dramatic explanations for his sudden and violent break with them. I'm just going to call it right here. His wife Zubaydah steadily turned him against the Baramika, egged on by self-interested officials who played on Arab v. Persian tensions. The number of Arab officials serving in the state began to increase right after al-Mansur passed away. On top of that, the Abna had been based in Baghdad for over 2 generations by now, and as the local urban elite, they could mix with their choice of locals. This process accelerated during al-Mahdi's decade in charge, and it had consequences for the relationship between the capital and the east. None of this would have come to the fore while the Baramika were on hand, but my point is the Arabization of the Abna was inevitably going to lead to conflict. Not only had the Arabized leadership built strong relationships with al-Hadi before his ascension, but a couple of them even encouraged the caliph to eliminate his brother Harun at the outset of his short reign, seeing him as a helpless puppet of the Baramika. The fact that al-Rashid forgave and re-empowered these officials following his mother's passing is one of his least relatable moves, and here too I see the influence of his wife. I'm beginning to feel like some of the sources I criticize that blame women whenever anything goes wrong, so let me explain before you judge me as harshly. Zubaydah was a Abbasid princess, the granddaughter of al-Mansur. She could not bear to see her grandfather's state fall into the hands of the foreign Baramika, who seemed to be in charge of everything from fiscal administration to royal tutelage, and occasionally even military command. It was the contest for succession between her son al-Amin and al-Ma'mun, who was born of a Persian concubine, that put her and the Baramika on the road to collision. While they were quick to recognize al-Ma'mun's fitness for office, their enemies surrounded al-Amin and lobbied the caliph hard for al-Amin to replace his slightly older brother as heir. This made the Arabized leadership Zubaydah's closest and most reliable allies. Good Harun al-Rashid's succession plan was the most deluded arrangement ever. Splitting the realm between 2 half-brothers, each with a set of hangers-on looking to eliminate the other, was downright irresponsible. I suppose we only see it that way because the unlikely thing happened when al-Ma'mun's forces conquered Baghdad and killed al-Amin. If the opposite had occurred, it would have made way more sense. Perhaps al-Rashid thought it was unavoidable that his son al-Amin would have to lead Baghdad to a great victory over the east to secure his grip on power, and he made sure that the deck was stacked in his favor. He took out the Baramika so the untested al-Ma'mun was left with no reliable allies to help guide him through the war. It's a little too Machiavellian for my taste, but I must admit it makes more sense than thinking al-Rashid expected the two halves of the caliphate to exist in perfect harmony. Still, though, if he wanted the two to fight, why go through all the trouble of making them publicly swear to abide by his designs in Mecca? He could have just signaled that Al-Amin was the more senior partner. Good Harun al-Rashid's closeness to the Arabs enabled him to accomplish something that had eluded his predecessors, bringing religious authorities into the state. Al-Mansur couldn't even coerce Ja'far al-Sadiq to serve at his court. One of the leading clerics in al-Rashid's day, a Kufan Hanafi scholar known as Abu Yusuf, was appointed to a newly created position of Qadi al-Qudat, or Supreme Judge. This represented a huge departure for the Ummah. Ever since the dynastic age, religion and state were quite separate for the Arabs. I don't mean secularism. Obviously, the caliphate was an Islamic institution, and its leader a Muslim leader, etc. But the understanding at the time was that it would be improper of a genuinely pious religious figure to associate with the state, because politics and government were bound to exact a sort of moral compromise. But the rebirth of Arab power under Harun al-Rashid made it possible for Abu Yusuf to assume an official title without losing credibility with the people. He wasn't there to amass riches, only to help this Abbasid champion of the Arabs keep the caliphate on the righteous path. What his appointment really accomplished, however, was further legitimize the dynasty and reinforce its claim as the rightful head of the Ummah. Good Harun al-Rashid emerges from the annals of Arab history as the most celebrated dynastic caliph. He was also immortalized in that literary behemoth that many consider synonymous with Arab culture, The 1001 Nights. While his depiction in that book is apocryphal, it goes to show how al-Rashid is regarded as a cultural icon, an archetype of the supremely powerful caliph. There's a magnificent work that sits somewhere in between history and culture, Abu Faraj al-Asfahani's Kitab al-Aghani, or Book of Songs. The massive work opens with the top 100 poems composed and sung for Harun al-Rashid. Al-Asfahani took the time to comment on the various composers and singers, often providing colorful background on the characters and events being described. The work contains so much material that in his History of the Arabs, Philippe Hette repeatedly cites the Book of Songs as a source, something he was criticized for by later scholars. And it wasn't just Al-Asfahani who captured the caliph in verse. This whole Good Harun al-Rashid bit was a reference to a poem by Alfred Tennyson, titled Recollections of the Arabian Nights. Well earned or not, this was the caliph who became the face of medieval Arab civilization. But as the saying goes, the higher they rise, the harder they fall. The disastrous war between Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun, rightfully known as the Great Fitna, tore the caliphate asunder and absolutely devastated Baghdad. The Arabized Abna failed to subdue the people of the East, and instead gave Al-Ma'mun's general Tahir one of history's most unexpected military upsets. Emboldened by their impossible victory, the Khurasani armies went on the offensive, gathering men and momentum as they barreled towards the capital. Al-Amin is described as either feckless or petulant, having no sense of leadership and more interested in spending time with his beloved servant boy Badr. Even somewhat complimentary sources agree that Al-Amin was ill-suited for his position, but there is widespread sympathy regarding his violent end. The caliph was captured after trying to escape the capital by boat, and Tahir quickly had him put to death. The Arab caliph was executed by the Khurasani general. I had a very high opinion of Al-Ma'mun before starting this podcast. His Cinderella-like underdog journey to the top is quite compelling. And then, as caliph, he's renowned for his rationalism and erudition. So what's not to love? I have to admit, though, reading our sources did somewhat dim that glowing image I had of him. Our histories make it clear that the Arabs never embraced this son of Harun al-Rashid. This is wholly unsurprising, considering the widespread destruction of the capital at the hands of a foreign, albeit Muslim, army. To make matters worse, al-Ma'mun didn't relocate to Baghdad until a full 5 years after his victory. His return was a step in the right direction, but by then, his government had already alienated a vast majority of the capital. Tahir, then his son, had to help the caliph put down rebellions in Arab provinces. It took them a few years, but after the Tahirids were done, they returned back home as governors of the East. Perhaps the part of his reign al-Ma'mun is most famous, or infamous for, was the Mihna, the supposed inquisition he decreed. While the Mihna did develop some ugly and authoritarian practices under the reigns of his brother and nephew after him, during al-Ma'mun's time it was actually quite restrained. The caliph favored a certain theological school and thus hired its adherents disproportionately. Its association with al-Ma'mun's government earned that school public enmity. Its most vocal and vitriolic opponents began to denounce it in bombastic terms, going so far as to proclaim it heretical. Al-Ma'mun's entire inquisition was just asking all the state's officials to declare that they did not believe this to be true. They didn't have to adhere to the caliph's favored theological school, they just couldn't say that it was heresy. Quite reasonable, wouldn't you agree? The fact that people continued to rally behind the firebrand preachers who opposed him is among the clearest expressions of how deeply the Arabs rejected al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun failed to restore the Abbasid Caliphate to glory, but he did lead the state onto a more stable foundation. The Tahirids proved to be loyal and reliable partners, and their success helped keep the caliphate safe and prosperous. His arrangement, whereby they became hereditary governors of Greater Khorasan in exchange for funding Baghdad's security, endured until the latter lost power generations later. Al-Ma'mun's only problem was that he had no armies he could use to control the western half of his realm, and he often relied upon his half-brother and the sizable personal guard of Turkish fighters that he'd amassed over the years. It's with this Abbasid's ascension that the dynasty's power was finally revived. Al-Mu'tasim was born of a Central Asian woman, and he survived the violent years of the civil war in Baghdad by surrounding himself with Turkic bodyguards. He already had a few thousand soldiers by the time he became caliph, and he used his newfound wealth and authority to expand the ranks of his personal army even further. In using a force entirely loyal to his person to reshape the caliphate, Al-Mu'tasim was following in the footsteps of his great-grandfather. The two even had the same idea of paying their troops in land and settling them around a new royal court. Al-Mansur allowed the Abna to reside in what became Baghdad, while Al-Mu'tasim founded Samarra. He deliberately chose to isolate his armies from the rest of the Ummah, even buying wives for his troops from their native lands so they would not intermarry with the locals. This gave him even more control over their lives and made them a deadlier fighting force. See, they weren't distracted by divided loyalties or ideological niceties, and they didn't have to worry about protecting their families. Everything was guaranteed by the caliph. All they had to do was win his wars. These Turks proved to be the most competent fighting force of their time. Even though they were the government's largest expense, they paid for themselves several times over by ensuring taxes were collected and extracting war booty from the Byzantine Empire. Since the troops obeyed only Al-Mu'tasim, the caliph's word was heeded throughout the realm, restoring his dynasty to its former glory. The key difference was that this revived version had a caliph dominant in the west and his Tahirid agents ruling in the east. Not having to worry about Khurasan gave al-Mu'tasim the room to focus on Iraq, Syria, and the Byzantine Empire. But one has to admit that no matter how loyal the Tahirids, no matter how ferocious the Turks in battle, the Abbasid Caliph no longer wielded the same kind of power. This is all to say nothing of Africa, where the Idrisids had taken over Morocco and the Aghlabids served as an independent buffer against them in Algeria. Al-Mu'tasim was a worthy successor of Al-Mansur, but all things considered, he doesn't quite measure up to his great-grandfather. The second age of Abbasid supremacy lasted around 30 years. Al-Mu'tasim ruled for 8, his son Al-Wathiq for 5, then his brother Al-Mutawakkil for 15. There's not much to say about Al-Wathiq. Like most sons of strong caliphs, he coasted on the stability of his father's administration and preferred to make as few changes as possible. His sudden death, however, revealed the flaw in this paradigm of executive power in the caliphate. The Turks had an existential interest in who became caliph. Any candidate who didn't rely on them entirely, as Al-Mu'tasim had, threatened their place in the Ummah. They worried that Al-Wathiq's son was too young, and so they elevated his brother as Al-Mutawakkil. Their choice was non-controversial, so everything worked out fine that time. But the realization that the Turks had the ability to effectively pick the next caliph was never forgotten, and their abuse of it down the line led to anarchy in Samarra and civil war in Baghdad. Before we skip right past this revival of Abbasid power, I just want to say a few words on religious developments during Al-Mutawakkil's reign. Many of the narrations in our sources celebrate this caliph and compare him to his grandfather Harun al-Rashid. Al-Mutawakkil is sometimes called Nasr al-Sunnah, or champion of the way of the Prophet. This can leave casual readers with the impression that he was a pious or at least conservative man, but there is nothing to that once one looks a little deeper. The Inquisition that started out harmlessly enough back in Al-Ma'mun's day had devolved into something more coercive under Al-Mu'tasim and especially Al-Wathiq. Al-Mutawakkil didn't exactly abandon it, but he reversed it, attacking the school of thought it had championed and encouraging the violent repression of many of its adherents. One similarity between Al-Mutawakkil and Al-Rashid was that both men oppressed the Hashemites more mercilessly than the rest of their kin. The elder was no match for his grandson in this contest, however, as Al-Mutawakkil ordered the destruction of Al-Husayn's shrine in Karbala, holy to many in the Ummah. It's difficult to see how all this Muslim-on-Muslim violence should have earned him a reputation for adherence to the Prophet's ways. Al-Mutawakkil's religious realignment of the state did make him popular. It also allowed him to fill the caliphate's judicial ranks with scholars who had a base of support in the city. Like Al-Rashid, Al-Mutawakkil's reign brought religion into politics further than it had gone before. It now felt legitimate for the state to label certain Muslim groups as heretical, signaling that their persecution would be for the benefit of the Ummah. It is perhaps no coincidence that it was during this caliph's reign that we find the very first mention of Sufism. This new, overtly personal approach to Islam came at a time when the government was interfering more aggressively than ever in matters of faith. Dhul Nun, a Sufi saint from Egypt, was brought to Al-Mutawakkil so the caliph could personally rule on this new and unorthodox sort of piety. The caliph was mainly concerned with and looking for expressions of Hashemite support, but after finding the saint to be truly detached from such worldly affairs, he allowed him to return to his life unmolested. After Al-Mutawakkil, came the deluge. His murder by Turks allied to his son and heir shook the caliphate, and after al-Muntasir's sudden death 6 months later, the Turks had to pick another successor, and that's when power got to their heads. Ruinous civil wars followed, exacerbated by the collapse of Tahirid power in the east and a brutal slave rebellion in Basra that raged across the province for over 15 years. This period of anarchy represented the lowest ebb of Abbasid power until then, the lowest ebb of any sort of authority in the caliphate, really. Salvation only came at the hands of an Abbasid general who fought alongside one of the Turkish factions, earning the trust of its commanders. He placed his brother on the throne so he could retain the freedom he needed to continue the fight against the many threats both surrounding the caliphate and within it. After over 20 years of blood, sweat, and tears, Talha, who is better known as al-Muwaffaq, managed to defend the capital and regain control of most of Iraq. Even better, his son was among his primary commanders, and so the Turks now had another Abbasid whom they could trust and support. It was this son, al-Mu'tadid, who gets the credit for giving his clan its third era of power. The Marshal Caliph campaigned for most of his decade in charge, restoring Abbasid authority across much of the Ummah, from Iran to Syria, with Egypt soon to follow. Even with this revival, the position of Caliph was a mere shadow of its former glory. They may have lived as sumptuously as their ancestors, but Abbasid caliphs ruled over less territory, had smaller armies, smaller budgets, and far less room for error than their predecessors enjoyed. The Khurasani Abna had been unconditionally loyal to al-Ma'mun. The Turks were loyal to al-Mu'tasim, who spent vast fortunes on his favorite armies. He could afford it. His kin were now in a far more precarious situation. Only Abbasids trusted by the Turks stood a chance at inheriting the mantle of leadership. The Turks usually tried to look out for their own interests, but they weren't a monolith either. Infighting among their leaders was a significant source of instability at times. But when they did unite, they agreed that the Caliph had to need them as much as they needed him, something that could only be guaranteed if he used none other than them in his military. This final Abbasid flirtation with greatness lasted around 30 years. 10 of real power under al-Mu'tadid, 6 of coasting under his passive son al-Muqtafi, then a sharp decline throughout the reign of another son, the ruinous al-Muqtadir. General Mu'nis, the last great leader of the Turks, proved to be one of the last anchors of stability for the state, and his loss doomed the caliphate to an interminable decline. The prodigal al-Muqtadir had bankrupted the state, and any wealthy lord could now hire an army to push for more autonomy. The dissolution of the realm was well underway before the Abbasids finally owned up to their impotence and divested their position of any executive or even administrative responsibilities. The creation of the role of High Commander, or Amir al-Umara, may have consigned their dynasty to irrelevance, but it allowed a different kind of flowering to occur. Independent dynasties across the realm began to claim that they were acting in the name of the Abbasid Caliph, praising his person in public prayers. Now that the Caliph was just a symbol, there was no harm in it, and it was a cheap and easy way to seem legit. It was this validation that attracted warlords to Baghdad. To have the Caliph directly as their ward would bestow an undeniable legitimacy and tarnish that of their foes. After exchanging hands back and forth multiple times among such warlords vying for power in Iraq, Baghdad and its Abbasid Caliph were finally conquered by the Buwayhids, who hailed from the southern shores of the Caspian. The Abbasid journey is too sprawling to fit into a neat schema. but I think the three phases of state power that I described are broadly accurate. Readers of any of the sources I used will sense an unmistakable decline as they progress through the first 2 centuries of the dynasty's rule. By the end of al-Muqtadir's reign, hostile nomadic tribes massacred pilgrims and even sacked the Kaaba, while a new da'wah led to the rise of a rival dynasty. Using the exact same Abbasid playbook, the da'wah promised to return the caliphate to the Prophet's family. The Fatimids appeared in Syria, The Fatimids first appeared in Syria, but quickly escaped Mu'nas's armies west and overran Algeria, from which they eventually took Egypt during the Buwayhid Age. While these were eventful years, I want to avoid regurgitating the history we covered together, and honestly there isn't much to comment on in terms of the Ummah's political and social evolution. Taking the long view of Abbasid history allows us to sum up the dynasty's missteps and weaknesses to a single sin: hyper-centralization. At almost every turn, Abbasid caliphs prioritized absolute personal power over long-term stability. Al-Mansur was lionized as their role model, and although it's true he wielded unmatched authority, he also relied on a huge coterie of administrators to run his state. Al-Rashid put an end to this fruitful collaboration when he annihilated the Baramika. Al-Ma'mun devised another successful partnership by entrusting the Tahirids to govern the east, but the caliph could never find partners in the Arab West to work with. His brother Al-Mu'tasim thus imported and elevated the Turks, whose military prowess allowed him to centralize power even further. The rest of the Abbasid story is the winding but ultimately predictable downfall of this fragile model of government. As this is the concluding episode of our podcast, I feel adding a conclusion here would be redundant. There's one more thing I would like to mention before closing out. Reading Al-Yaqubi, Al-Tabari, and Al-Mas'udi, I was struck by how their histories looked back at the past. I suppose it's a trivial observation. After all, where else are historians supposed to look? But it's not that they looked back, but how they looked back. There's a real sense of loss in the way they describe their people's journey. One explanation is that they wrote these works between the late 9th and middle 10th centuries, a chaotic period in which the caliphate's prestige was waning further and further. That only half explains matters, however. It's one thing to say that the Abbasid Caliphate isn't what it used to be under Al-Mansur or Al-Rashid, but our sources go further. Although it sometimes goes unsaid, the true locus of their nostalgia isn't the greatness of the caliphate, but the lost moral rectitude of the ummah. These sources, and many others that I've read, all look back to the halcyon days of the Prophet and his companions and regard their generation as the true golden age. The social and political development that followed during the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties is thus regarded with a kind of disdain, as a worldly deviation from the path God had laid out for his faithful. I'm sure it's their personal piety that leads our scholars to present such a view, but I find it ill-suited to the study of history. It prohibits the adoption of a progressive view of human endeavor, one where each generation strives to improve things. Every age has its challenges, against which there will invariably be triumphs, losses, and missed opportunities. An honest accounting of a people's journey through the centuries would leave room for such growth and development. Instead, what we find is a tale of a fall from grace. Not a rise and fall of power like I so often say, but the rise of corruption followed by the ummah's damnation. This view has unfortunately survived to this very day, and undergirds most conservative Islamic schools of thought, like Salafism. Their adherents preach that a return to glory is possible, but only if the Ummah reverts to the teachings and conducts of Muhammad's blessed companions, al-Salaf al-Salih. As a final word, I want to lay out what I believe is the fundamental flaw of this premise. At the core of religious revivalist movements is the contention that the example of early Islam can provide a perfect and comprehensive set of laws with which human societies can be governed. This view thus holds the Prophet's generation as the purest expression of the ideal society. In the Salafi narrative, things went awry because the Arabs abandoned their religious commitments, falling short of the examples of piety set by their ancestors. I find that to be a misreading of history, and think the Ummah went in a different direction for sociological reasons. To reprise the two hypothetical Arabs we'd conjured earlier, there were simply far more in the Ummah like Abdul Rahman, the one who hailed from a large tribe that converted to Islam late, than Salih, who hailed from a small early adopter of the religion. These fictional stand-ins had very different journeys before being united by Muhammad. It was natural for them to disagree after his death, and for the more numerous and better united group to come out on top. When faced with the political and social questions of their expanding realm, the Arabs correctly recognized that they did not already have the answers. They drew on a multitude of sources to come up with their own solutions to the consequential issues of their day. The end result was a blend of their own cultural ideas and the examples left behind by the empires they'd replaced. Religion was not considered a template which the evolving caliphate could model. Instead, Islam was understood to transcend such worldly concerns entirely. Officials should behave piously, but importing religion into the state would have been seen as debasing. This stance on Islam being above the political proved enduring. When the Abbasids came to power, al-Mansur's attempt to bring religious figures into the state were rebuffed. When later caliphs succeeded after the breakthroughs of al-Rashid and al-Mutawakkil, the results were predictable. The state had no interest in promoting piety, only to employ religion in transparently self-serving ways. Official judges and imams preached the virtues of obedience and enduring hardship to the masses and lavished praise on their caliphs. Bringing religion into the state made it worse, more oppressive, more insulting, and more disenchanting. Now you can argue that I'm attacking straw men, that these examples I'm giving aren't genuine attempts at emulating the Prophet's conduct, but misapplications of religion. I actually agree with that. But in order to find the correct application of Islam in the social or political spheres, I believe the first step is to correctly identify its social or political characteristics. It's true that the Prophet led a community for over a decade, but that doesn't mean he presents a usable model for governance. Islam was not the birth of a new state. It was a revolution against an unjust world. Examples of Islam as a revolution can be found everywhere in the history we covered. Most of the rebellions against Umayyad rule effortlessly adopted the rhetoric of religious movements. The Abbasid Da'wah intentionally cast itself as a movement to restore the Ummah to the Prophet's example, as did the Fatimid Da'wah after it. The descendants of Al-Hussein, the most explicitly religious branch of the Hashemites, were always held to be the most potent threats to the Caliphate, be it Umayyad or Abbasid. The Kharijites, the Qaramita, even the slave rebellion in Basra, used the language of the religious to express their grievances and justify their break with the Ummah. Since Islam is at heart a revolution against power, the rules applied by the Prophet should never be considered independently from what they replaced. They were never intended to be eternal laws to be emulated. Instead, they represent vectors of progress, away from something unjust towards a new alternative. In order to best follow the Prophet's example, one must ask what injustice he was attempting to replace. Considered this way, the main social and political lesson we can take away from Islam is to never accept injustice and tyranny, but to unite the downtrodden against them. Making a state religion out of the faith warps Islam into its antithesis, a tool of oppression instead of a playbook for liberation. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying around to hear absolutely everything I have to say about the history we covered. I'm not sure if you'll hear from me again. There are a couple podcasts that I may contribute to. If anything materializes, I'll post a link on this episode's page on our website, thecaliphs.com. Oh, there's also a listener who is looking to start a similar podcast covering Ottoman history. I really hope he moves forward with his project. He shared the sources he's interested in reading, and they seem like great counterparts to the ones I picked for early Islam. I'll post a link on the same page if it comes together. As for starting another podcast of my own, I don't know, listener. Never say never, I guess. But Arab history really fascinated me, and I'm not sure I expect to experience that again. Who knows, though? Maybe I'll come across an especially dense tome I need help getting through. I now know exactly what to do if that happens. Until then, thanks again for being a faithful companion of the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power.